Hi everyone. So I'm actually really excited to share this article with you because it's a great real-world example that can be used for many concepts in the global economy unit as well as the macroeconomics unit. And I'll talk to you about that in a minute. This article is called America's Strong Dollar is Hurting Everyone Else, and it was published by CNN Business on August 7th, 2022. Okay, the writer is Julia Horowitz, so I'll just kind of make sure I refer to her as the writer from now on. Now, the key concepts, the three out of the nine central concepts that this article combines, are change, the concept of change, economic well-being, and interdependence. So, how do the three connect in the context of the article? Well, changes in the exchange rate of the US dollar are negatively affecting the economic well-being of many countries around the world due to the interdependence between nations or countries in this global economy that we live in. So let's see what the article is talking about. So I'm not going to read the whole article because that's boring. I'll have the article linked in the description below. I summarized the first part. So basically what's happening is that increase in foreign demand for the US dollar, there's an increase in foreign demand for the US dollar due to more attractive investment opportunities. Okay, investors are basically worried about a global recession, and so they have rushed up to buy or scoop up dollars because the US dollar is considered a safe haven, a safe investment during turbulent or tough times. So the Federal Reserve, which is the central bank of the United States of America, on top of that, has an aggressive campaign of raising interest rates to try to curb high inflation in the United States. So both the Federal Reserve's raising of interest rates as well as global investors worrying about a global recession, all of this is making American investments more attractive because they now offer high returns. So if you draw a diagram with, say, price of US dollars in Egyptian pounds, the reason I chose Egyptian pounds is because the article does mention Egypt as one of the economies that is being negatively affected. So you've got price of US dollars in EGP, quantity of US dollars, and there's an increase in foreign demand. There's a shift in the demand for the US dollar to the right, which is causing the exchange rate to rise. This is causing an appreciation of the US dollar. So what, you might be asking? Well, the thing is, the problem is half of international trade is invoiced in US dollars. So manufacturers and small businesses that need to import, manufacturers and small businesses that need to import goods or raw materials are seeing that their costs of production are rising. So you have higher costs of production for importing non-US manufacturers and small businesses, and higher debt servicing costs for foreign governments. Foreign governments that have to repay, foreign governments that have to repay their debt, whatever money they borrowed in US dollars, because investors won't accept their own local currency, are also getting into trouble. So what that's causing is it's creating cost push inflation in many economies. One of them mentioned is Sri Lanka, which has the Sri Lankan rupee. So here I've got real GDP of Sri Lanka in Sri Lankan rupees and the average price level. And because of the higher costs of importing raw materials and the higher debt servicing costs for the government, that is adding to the cost of production across the whole economy. So it's shifting the short run aggregate supply to the left. There's a decrease in short run aggregate supply, which is causing real GDP to shrink and the average price level to rise. It's causing both stagnation when it comes to economic growth. So actually, you know what? I'm just going to say stagnant economic growth. Stagnant economic growth. And at the same time, it's causing inflation. This phenomenon combined together is what we call stagflation. Okay? So the economy, like Sri Lanka, Egypt, many economies mentioned in the article, are suffering from stagflation as a result of the higher costs of production for importing non-US manufacturers and small businesses and the higher debt servicing costs for foreign governments. Okay? Now, A shortage, and here he gives a really good, Julia, the writer, gives a really good real world example. A shortage of dollars in Sri Lanka contributed to the worst economic crisis in the country's history, ultimately forcing its president out of office last month. Egypt is also battered by rising food prices and is dealing with a depleted store of dollars and an exodus of foreign investment. Many foreign investors are taking their investments in the Egyptian economy out. An exodus means like a mass exit of foreign investment. So here you've got some good real world examples, the Egyptian economy and the Sri Lankan economy as examples of LEDCs, less economically developed countries that are hurt by this appreciating US dollar. Okay, and here the author, Julia, talks a little bit more about how Sri Lanka, the island nation, faces a grave fuel shortage because there's a lack of foreign currency. So why is this a problem? Well, the US dollar generally tends to climb in value when America's economy is very strong, or also when America's economy is very weak and the world's facing a recession. So when the American economy is very strong, people view the American dollar as a safe investment, the American economy as a safe place to invest. But also, when the American economy is not doing very well and the rest of the world's facing a recession, investors around the world like to still invest in the American economy as well. So that's called the dollar smile. Investors in either situation view the country's currency as an opportunity to lock in growth and a relatively secure place to park cash while they ride out the storm. And this is called the dollar smile since the dollar rises at both extremes. Okay? So, what are the three main reasons that the author lists that a stronger dollar could hurt countries around the world with smaller economies? Here we're talking mainly about LEDCs, countries with smaller economies. Number one, it can add to fiscal strain. Okay, remember, many LEDCs have no choice but to issue their debt in order to borrow. They have to issue it denominated in dollars. But if the value of the dollar rises, this makes it more expensive for them to repay their liabilities, and it drains government tax revenue. It drains the government coffers. Okay, so here I've got a poverty cycle, and this is what I love about economics. You'll notice I had a foreign exchange diagram showing why the US dollar is appreciated, and then I had a macroeconomic aggregate demand, aggregate supply diagram showing one economy that is being hurt by this appreciating dollar. And then here I have a poverty cycle. Now remember, in the poverty cycle, low income leads to low saving, which then leads to low investment, which then leads to low productivity. Low productivity then leads to low income, and so on. So you might be thinking, well, how does debt or liability come into this, the increase in government debt because the US dollar is becoming more expensive? Well, remember, debt is a liability, and by definition, a liability is negative saving. So this saving here is turning negative. All right. Can you imagine how that would affect the investment rates in any of those economies that are being mentioned, and lower the productivity rates and lead to lower income? So many LEDCs are finding it more difficult to escape the poverty cycle because of this increasing debt. It makes it costlier for governments or businesses to import food, medicine, and fuel. And this is really what happened in Sri Lanka. The rupee crashed against the dollar. The government drained all of its foreign reserves, which were already low because there was a slump in tourism during COVID. And the shortages of essential items, many people went out to the streets and just rioted, and that forced the president out of office. The second problem of this rising dollar right now is that it feeds capital flight. When a country's currency dramatically weakens, remember, if the dollar is appreciating, that means the Sri Lankan rupee and the Egyptian pound are depreciating against the dollar. And this encourages wealthy individuals, companies, and foreign investors to withdraw their money, hoping to stash it somewhere safer. And that pushes the currency down even lower, exacerbating fiscal problems, making them even worse. This is what's happening to the Egyptian pound right now. Lots of investors are taking out their investments from the Egyptian economy, and that's further pushing down the value of the Egyptian pound, making it more difficult for the Egyptian government to import essential items and Egyptian businesses to import essential items, and for the Egyptian government to repay its debts. The last problem is that it weighs on growth. It slows down economic growth. If firms cannot afford the imports they need to run their businesses, and that means they won't have as much inventory. That means they won't be able to sell as much. even if demand stays robust, it weighs on economic output. Now, if the US economy is growing, it might not really be a problem because many of those LEDCs, those emerging markets, export goods to the United States economy. Okay? So, if basically the US economy was growing, the increase in AD as a result of the exports that the United States buys from those LEDCs will offset the decrease in short run aggregate supply. Okay, so you have increase in AD due to higher export revenue will offset the decrease in short run aggregate supply. So while the average price level may rise, real GDP remains relatively stable. But that's not what's happening here. What's happening here is that America is on the brink of recession, which means there isn't this increased American demand or foreign demand for the country's exports. So this actually inflicts more pain. Remember, this diagram here isn't showing what is happening. It's showing what could be happening if the US economy is growing. But the US economy is on the brink of recession. So here, there is no increase in AD to offset the decrease in short run aggregate supply, which can inflict more pain on the markets because they don't have that silver lining of better economic growth in the background. Okay? Now, a crisis contained. Here, the author, she kind of talks about how there are some reasons why it isn't that bad. Okay? She also talks about Ghana and Kenya, who have high debt loads. So you've got Sri Lanka, Egypt, Ghana, Kenya, Tunisia. These are all economies that are affected. And the IMF has estimated that 60% of low-income countries are in or at high risk of government debt distress, compared to about 20% or one-fifth a decade ago. Okay? And here, the author, she starts evaluating. Okay, this is what I love about reading the news from the lens of IB Economics. Here she mentions key differences between the current situation and past crises. What are those key differences? First of all, she's saying that dollar-denominated debt is less common. Okay, lots of large economies like Brazil, Mexico, and Indonesia hold enough foreign exchange reserves to manage their external debt load. Also, the prices of commodities, essential commodities like oil and base metals, remain high. You might be thinking, well, how does that help? Well, a lot of emerging economies or LEDCs are major exporters of oil and those metals. Okay, so that's still keeping them, ensuring that dollars are still flowing into the government coffers. Inflation has also pushed central banks in many emerging markets, in many LEDCs, to start raising their interest rates earlier than their peers at the Federal Reserve, which is the US Central Bank, as well as the Bank of England, which is the Central Bank of England, the British Central Bank. Okay, so here the author is kind of evaluating. She's saying that dollar-denominated debt is becoming less common. At the same time, lots of countries still have, especially large economies, large LEDCs, have foreign exchange reserves, and many of them still export oil and base metals. So that's still kind of ensuring that there's a flow of US dollars. Okay. At the same time, inflation in many of those emerging markets has encouraged central banks to start raising interest rates. Okay. Still, much could hinge on the fate of the world's two biggest economies, the United States and China. If these two economies are generally engines of growth, if they begin to stall or slow down, many emerging markets could see a painful outflow of investment. If the US economy and the Chinese economy start to slow down their economic growth, they won't be buying as much exports from these emerging economies, from these LEDZs, and that could eventually lead to slower economic growth and an outflow of investment. And this is again the beautiful and a beautiful example of the concept of interdependence. Remember, the global economy is very interdependent. When something happens somewhere, it doesn't just impact that place; it has an impact around the world. So it will be critical here, the author ends by saying, it will be critical whether the United States goes into a recession. Okay, it makes everybody more risk averse. And there you go. I just went through the article, I evaluated, I discussed what's happening. There's an appreciation in the US dollar because many of the world's economies are facing recession, and that's causing the US dollar to appreciate, which increases the cost of production for many small businesses that cannot afford to buy their essential imports. At the same time, many smaller economies, LEDCs, are being locked into this cycle of debt, which makes it harder to escape the poverty cycle, and they're experiencing this is so weird. Like, I'm just looking at this ad right now, and it's repeated like 3 times. It's so weird. I took a screenshot, and apparently, this is what CNN Business thinks I want to be seeing. Anyway, let's get back to the article. Focus. Okay, so again, it's mentioned Egypt and Sri Lanka. We've seen a macroeconomics diagram showing cost push inflation. We've seen a foreign exchange diagram showing appreciation of the US dollar. Okay. Let me know if you have any questions. I am posting more of these videos for members in the membership section. If you like this video, please like, share, subscribe. Please consider clicking on the link to buy me a coffee and making a donation, which is a way of saying thank you, but it also motivates me to keep creating content. And yeah, please, if you have any questions, leave them in the comments section below, and have a great rest of your August. Those of you who are returning to school, I hope you have a great start to the school year.